All right, all right. Hi, my name is Carlita Sterling, and I am a former client, which I love to say, former client of Uncommon Law. I was sentenced to 25 years to life, and I actually served 32 years in prison. And I'm currently the president for the executive board of directors. Um, I'd like to give a brief overview of our program today. Our program today is part two of How We Heal event series, which has brought our community together to explore questions about why violence happens, what we're doing wrong in our approaches to violence, and how communities can move towards healing and safety after violence happens. Today, we'll hear from some incredible advocates who will help take these questions even further. Just to explain today's program, the campaign uplifts the voices and stories of people differently impacted by violence, people who have caused violence, and people who have experienced violence, to explore the similarity in those experiences and how together we can imagine different responses to violent crimes. I just, later in the show, I will actually share what I think is missing. But I like to, at this time, introduce a video. This particular campaign uses live events and powerful video series to explore experiences of violence and responses to violent crimes. We're so grateful to everyone who shared their stories with us, particularly in our video series, which we're going to share a piece of that now.
My name is Ann O. Johnson, and I am Damien's mother, and we've been on this road a long time now. When Damien went to prison, it was heartbreaking. One of the worst things that I had experienced in life. He had just made 18 years old 2 months prior.
I remember just thinking that this was a dream and I was going to wake up. 15 years to life.
My dad was always in prison. It was just something that always existed. So it was just where I would go to see my dad.
Growing up, the child of someone in prison is in itself a horrific trauma. During my time in prison, I did everything I could to be a good father, which is very difficult from inside prison. The prison system certainly does not support that.
When I was a little girl, my dad used to put me on his shoulders, and he would get written up for that. Or written up for hugging me in the middle of a visit instead of at the beginning or the end.
Sometimes they wouldn't let her visit me. She would come all the way up there and they wouldn't let her visit me. They've harassed my moms and treated her like she was less than human for supporting me.
When he got out, I was able to really experience the loss that I had buried inside. Why is this happening when I'm already in my 20s? I was 22 when my dad had gotten out, already grown up.
My name is Rhoda Stern, and this is my son, Christopher Robin Hotchkiss. He was my only son, and he was murdered when he was almost 22.
My name is Israel, and I'm the Supervising Parole Success Advocate at Uncommon Law. After I committed the crime that I committed, I was a perpetrator, I was an offender. I was 15 when I committed the crime in 1995, which also meant I was a super predator. Being assigned all these labels, I don't know what else to do other than start to believe them as true.
When the crime first happened, I had this prejudice in my head that murderers were ugly and, mean looking. And the first time I went into prison, it wasn't like that.
My name is Charles Spence, and I was incarcerated for 22 years. When I committed my crime at the age of 16, I started out at High Desert State Prison. My life became about survival. I couldn't think about empathy or compassion. Those things would have made me more vulnerable in the environment I was in. And when I got to San Quentin, there was a lot of older people that had been inside the system for decades, people like me who had committed harm, and they guided me. I really started to be able to focus inwardly and start to figure out what were the things in my life that ultimately led to this decision and the hurt that was caused. And when I did that, my entire life changed.
Part of the victim offender work is that you write a letter to the person that you've harmed and ask for forgiveness. And incarcerated gentleman read his letter, and I felt like he was reading it to me. I just started crying. I could see the difference that my sharing and them sharing made. It was pretty magical.
It starts with treating people inside as members of the community. Having been in prison for 38 years and watching people come in, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, young men are very disposable. It's the heart of everything that's wrong with what we do.
People are forced to place themselves in these tiny little boxes that are labeled with these dehumanizing, derogatory terms. There's no room through the system for people to do that in like this compassionate way. There's this dichotomy created by the system. People who suffered the harm are also like siloed, and they're absolutely told, do not engage in the process of forgiveness.
And they want you to be angry. They want you to believe in the death penalty. Nobody should ever get out ever. People say to me, well, how could you forgive? I said, for me. People think forgiveness is for the other person, and forgiveness is really for you.
I just feel like everything is all about the punishment, and that doesn't have to be the case.
Your system, in many ways, is about perpetuating the hurt and the harm. The system doesn't lead this work. Most lifers that I've met, they're the ones that are going out and like advocating for the younger people that are inside to come to these programs, right? In order to stop this cycle, in order to make sure that our communities don't have as much harm committed against them.
I don't think that there are a great distinction between the needs of somebody who is harmed and somebody who commits harm. I also harm myself. In addition to the person whose life I took, my family, my community, I did a tremendous amount of harm to myself. To say that I as a person deserve to recognize the harm that I did to myself and that I deserve healing. Just that in and of itself is a huge contribution to like this healing cycle.
Wow. No matter how many times I see that, it's very touching. I want to encourage you to check out the rest of the video. Very powerful. You can see the link on the screen. Also, I want to share with you that this is an active fundraiser to support our ongoing work this year, and people can donate. You can donate at the same link that's posted on the screen. So I encourage you and hope that you would donate, and I thank you very much. I want to introduce our panelists today. Tanish Hollins. Tanish Hollins is a crime survivor and the executive director of Californians for Safety and Justice, which is the Alliance for Safety and Justice's flagship. It's a state-based program in California. Tanish is an incredible leader who has pushed California to improve support for crime victims while also upholding and advancing progressive criminal justice reform policies. She has worked tirelessly to bring the voices of survivors to the center of community engagement and public policy for nearly 2 decades. Keith Watley. Keith is the founder and executive director of Uncommon Law. And since he's usually in the facilitator seat, it's exciting to have him here today as panelist. Keith has been advocating for the rights of people in prison and on parole for more than 2 decades. Uncommon Law helps people sentenced to life in prison for serious and violent crimes heal from the things that they put them in path of harming others and ultimately being released from prison. Azim Kamisa is our final panelist, and we will get to share a quick video actually about to highlight Azim's story.
Time now for our Friday Making a Difference report and the story of a man whose capacity for forgiveness is astonishing. He suffered the worst loss a parent can ever face, and yet he decided to turn his grief into something positive for himself and a troubled young man. Here's NBC's John Larson.
A documentary began the story like this.
14-year-old Tony Hicks shot and killed 20-year-old Tariq Kamisa.
A 14-year-old murders a promising young college student for the cost of a pizza and becomes the youngest child in California history charged as an adult with murder and gets life in prison.
It was like a nuclear bomb going off in my heart.
Azim Kamisa, the father of the victim, buried his only son Tariq according to their Muslim custom. He climbed down into the muddy grave. It had been raining, and they lowered his son's body wrapped in a white cloth down into his open arms.
Yeah, I didn't want to leave him there alone. I stayed there a long time. When something bad happens, you can stop that bad from happening to other people.
But when he finally came up, he did something remarkable.
It is wrong to lie, to cheat.
First, he forgave the family of the killer.
It was a defining moment in my life.
Only through that forgiveness,
which in turn helped Azim start the Tariq Kamisa Foundation, speaking together to more than 1 million children about the real pain of violence.
And sometimes it scars the soul forever.
Then, Azim visited Tony Hicks, the killer, who had never had a father, and forgave him too.
his forgiveness wasn't something I expected.
Now Azim is lobbying to have Tony released from prison early, like he was his own son.
And when he gets out of prison, what do you hope for him?
We'll have a job for him at the foundation.
So you're going to hire him?
Absolutely.
This is the killer of your son?
Yes.
Tony says now he knows what a real father is.
I had a man forgive me for taking the life of his son.
And he will work for that father, and for many who maybe never had fathers, someday, whether he gets out early or not. John Larson, NBC News, San Diego, California.
I just want to remind the audience or share with you that at the end, we will have a Q&A. You can post your questions in the comment section, and our panelists will have an opportunity to answer the questions at the end of the program. Again, this campaign aims to bring together the voices and experiences of people differently impacted by harm, people who have seriously harmed others, and people who have been harmed, to find commonality and work as allies to end cycles of violence. None of us can profess to have a single solution, but every person on this call has a personal story, often one that serves as a pathway to healing for others. Keith, to kick us off, can you talk a little bit about how you see the current state of criminal justice reform and the barriers to it, particularly as it relates to the work of uncommon law?
Well, thank you. Thanks for that question, and I appreciate being with both Tanisha and Azim. Obviously, I've been familiar with both of your work for a while, and glad to be having this conversation. Tanisha, seems like it's been way too long since we've connected on something. Good to see you again. I think that the current state of things is mixed, is what I'll say. I think the people don't really understand the power they have. And I think our elected officials really refuse to use the power with which they've been entrusted by the people. And as a result, I think we see occasional proposals that basically tinker around the edges of the criminal legal system, but mostly leave things intact. We have the same people who are in prison, and the same people are holding the keys. I think we keep playing the game. Thinking about the work specifically we do with parole, I sometimes refer to it as respectability parole, meaning the lights that shine the brightest or have the most connections or wealth or influence are the ones that get held up as the examples, but everybody else suffers in prison. Most people don't have that kind of access, and I think we never really address how we all heal on an individual level, a community level, from the harms that people experience and the harms they sometimes cause. So I'm glad we have this conversation to shine some light on maybe some different perspectives that people should be considering. I think one problem with even the concept of criminal justice reform is that like those words don't really fit what's needed right now. I mean, we label something criminal when black and brown and low wealth people do it. Um, and we too often are seeking justice from courts or jail or prison system that's not designed for justice. Um, and I think we're trying to reform a system that, and we're hoping that's going to produce something different. I don't think it's. I think we might even be delusional to think that this system is going to produce something different. We really need to reimagine the rules and the decision makers. We need to eliminate life sentences. We need to provide trauma responsive counseling before and instead of sending people to prison. And while we're doing all that, we also need to create some some ways to help people who are currently incarcerated to safely navigate this discretionary parole system. And I highlight that because, and that's where our work really lives. But more than half the people in California prisons will go through the parole board. And the more we study that process, the more we recognize that all the biases that exist in every stage of the criminal legal process live right at the discretionary parole end of things, and it's basically unchecked. That the same biases show up, that black and brown people are more likely to have to go through that process and least likely to be successful when they appear before the parole board. I think there are a lot of truths that we need to start telling that we haven't really done yet. And I'm glad we're getting a chance to start to do some of that and highlight some different perspectives today. So happy to be a part of this conversation and looking forward to where we go with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Azim, you've talked about healing looking like forgiveness to you, for you. Can you talk about your journey and the power of forgiveness in your own life and the impact it's had on you in dealing with the loss of your son?
Sure. And thank you, Carletha, and thank you for inviting me on this important panel. I remember soon after I lost my only son, I've authored 5 books. I'm an avid writer. I remember putting in my journal that there's nothing quite so painful as a broken heart. There's nothing quite so painful as a broken heart, but a broken heart is an open heart. If one can learn to live with an open heart, gentle transformations begin to manifest. So working also in prisons, I see a lot of broken hearts. There are. I love the video. Prior to my video, somebody made the comment that people that are incarcerated are part of our community. And I want to acknowledge Uncommon Law for the work they do with empathy, compassion, and practicing restorative justice, because I truly believe there are a lot of resources in our incarcerated people. Now, of course, mine is a personal story, and there's no one way of healing. Tarek was a college student at San Diego State University. He was a gifted writer, a brilliant photographer, and aspired someday to work for National Geographic. He loved to travel, liked cultures, and his hero was Gandhi, a man of peace. And he was lured to a bogus address, as you saw on the video, by a youth gang. And in a gang initiation, a 14-year-old shot and took his life. And needless to say, it brought my life to a crashing halt. I don't know what's harder for a parent than to lose a child. It's something you never ever get over. But sometimes in deep trauma, uh, there is a spark of clarity. Every saint has suffered the dark night of the soul. And needless to say, that was the dark night of the soul. And that spark of clarity in my tragedy was I downloaded that there were victims at both ends of the gun. It didn't come from my intellect or my loving heart. I practice as a Sufi Muslim. I meditate. And my son was alive. I meditate an hour a day. Today, my practice is 2 hours a day. So I believe that this download, that there are victims at both ends of the gun, was a gift from a higher power. Now, it's easy to see that Tariq was a victim of the young man that took his life, but I think it takes an open heart and empathy and compassion to see that Tony was also a victim of American society. And that begs the question, who is American society? And, where I went with all of this tragedy is that I didn't really know there were youth gangs. I grew up in Kenya. I left Kenya after Idi Amin was in neighboring Uganda. We were a minority targeted, thinking my children would be safe in America. I moved here about 50 years ago. I worked in international finance. I speak a half a dozen languages, so it was not even in a radar screen. And I was shocked to see the challenges we have in our country. We lose a young soul every hour. We've just gone through Uvalde and Sandy Hook, and all of these tragedies bring back that memory. You relive it every time I hear about it. So my perspective was that Tony was not the enemy, that the real culprit was a societal peer forces that force many young men and young women, that are black and brown, to fall to the crack and that get involved with crime and gangs and drugs and alcohol and weapons. That was the real culprit. So 9 months after my son died, I tend to honor him. I decided that I must, and having learned all of these horrific statistics, I felt that I must take my share of the responsibility for the bullet that took my son's life. Why? Because it was fired by an American child. Because societies do not just happenstance. Every one of us who is an American is responsible for the society we've created. I think Keith talked about that. And children killing children is not a mark of a civil society, although we like to think that we are a civil society. So the mandate of the Tariq, the foundation is named after my son. It's called the Tariq Kamisa Foundation. TKF.org is our website. Our initial mandate was to stop kids from killing kids by breaking the cycle of youth violence, and essentially had three mandates. First and foremost was to save lives of children. Important to do, because as we all know, we lose so many every single day. Our second mandate was to empower them with the right choices so they don't fall to the crack and end up in lives of crime and gangs and drugs and alcohol and weapons. And the third was to teach the principles of nonviolence, of accountability, of empathy, of compassion, of forgiveness, of peacemaking and peace building. And soon after I started the foundation, I reached out to Tony's grandfather. You met him on the video, with the attitude that I'm not here screaming revenge and retribution because your grandson took the life of my son. Rather, I see that we both lost a son. Tony lived with his grandfather and calls him daddy. I can't bring my son back. And there's nothing you can do to get Tony out of the adult criminal justice system. But the one thing you and I can do is to make sure no other father or grandfather suffers like you and I have done in our community. And he was very, very quick to take my hand of forgiveness. And we would never have met had his grandson not take the life of my son. African American, my roots are Eastern, he is Christian, I am Muslim, and we are brothers. And I think that is because of that hand of forgiveness. And we're still together. The foundation is in its 27th year. And we are very active in middle schools. We focus from 4th grade to 9th grade. Tony joined a gang in 6th grade and took Tariq's life in 8th grade. And I'm glad to say, with the grace of God, the foundation is successful in keeping kids away from gangs and drugs and alcohol and weapons, and also successful in teaching these values of empathy and compassion and forgiveness and peace building, peace within themselves, peace within their schools, peace within their communities, and peace within, hopefully someday, in our society. I met Tony when he was 19, and he was at Pelican Bay, and high security prison, and advocated for his release. I was at his parole hearing, and even the commissioner was very touched because he said, I've never had a victim father advocate for the offender's release. But he was given parole in 2019. He's 41 years old now. And after staying in a halfway home for about 6 months, he's moved in with his grandfather and is now also volunteering, as his grandfather and I have done, making sure other kids do not follow in his former footsteps. In fact, we're flying out to Chicago to speak at a conference together. And I know that we've saved Tony, but more importantly, he will save many, many lives. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Tanish, we see a lot. Thank you so much, Azim, for that. Very, very touching. Tanish, we see a lot of narratives about what survivors of crime want. These often focus on extreme punishment and erase demands for restorative justice or alternative to prison. In your experience, what are some of the things we are getting wrong here?
First, I just want to start by saying how deeply honored I am to be joining this panel and the power behind these testimonies that we've heard. Mr. Azim, so much love and appreciation to you in the way that you are carrying on your son's love and legacy. And Keith, so much kudos to Uncommon Law and all the work that you all are doing, and for making space for survivor voices in this conversation. Because to your point earlier, as we talked about the criminal justice reform landscape, the issues that survivors face and how we feel and what we need is often hyper politicized and put at odds, squarely at odds, against the work that we are all involved in one way or another to restore our communities and heal and bring safety. To your question, Carly, about what survivors want and need and what is often got wrong, there are a couple of things that I just kind of orient to when I speak about this, both from a personal perspective as a survivor, but also as someone who's working on policy and organizing with survivors in California and throughout the country. First and foremost is that, every survivor has their own ideas and feelings about what justice means for them in the harms that they've experienced or may have been committed against their family members. And too many of us have never really realized justice or had it actualized in our lives, not just from what may have happened, what harms may have occurred, but the communities that we come from being, unjustly impacted by the criminal legal system and some of the other systems. Yet people do have a right, to have their own ideas about what it's going to take to restore them and their families and their communities and make them whole. The problem is that our justice system is a one size fits none for the majority of us. The other is that the approaches that the criminal justice system has taken for decades in this country has not led to safety. And when you talk to most survivors, what they want more than anything is to be safe. What they want is for what happened to them or to their loved one to never happen to anyone else, or for it to never have happened in the first place. What most will vocalize is that their lives have been irreversibly changed, which is a common thing that you also hear from folks who may have committed harms. And you've heard that through the testimonies of Mr. Azim and through Keith and all of our personal stories. But the misconception, again, feeds a larger narrative. And, we all have done our work, through speaking with folks who have committed harm and folks like myself and Mr. Azim who've experienced terrible losses of people who are very close to us and became victims through that process of dealing with what happened to our family members. One of the greatest crimes against survivors is that there is very little immediate support and very little benefit offered through the criminal legal system for survivors to rebuild their lives, for them to restore their lives, for them to heal, and for them to get the support that they need to expand a definition of safety that really does address the root cause of the problem. And we've heard that nationally, through working through Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice with over 100,000 members across the country. In the state of California, over 14,000 members from all walks of life, all experiences. The commonalities that we do have between survivors who have been harmed and folks who carry both identities are very, very similar. But the ideas about what it will take for us to heal and to prevent this from happening again, as I mentioned earlier, are often hyper politicized. And we see that right now. Just thinking about the landscape and how it's impacting survivors in this conversation around safety in real time. We in the state of California are experiencing a lot of things, not just here in California, but across the country. We are experiencing the ongoing impact of a global health crisis through COVID-19, the pandemic, the impact it's had on our daily lives, the systems that we've all relied on that are now have been exposed. Many of us have known, especially if you come from communities that have been marginalized, that our school systems, our education systems, our health systems had challenges, but we saw them in real time dealing with this pandemic. And that has an impact on safety because violence and crime are public health issues. And that often gets lost in the conversation. So what does that have to do with survivors? Well, in this moment, the voices of survivors, the needs of survivors, the impact on survivors is being exploited in a larger conversation about what should happen around safety and specifically around criminal justice reform. And when you talk to survivors one-on-one, what they say is, I need help. I need help right now meeting my daily needs. I need to make sure I don't lose my home, my housing. I need to have support to deal with the trauma that I've experienced or that my family members, my community at large is experiencing as a result of what happened to me or to my loved one. That I would like to have a say-so in what justice looks and feels like in my particular situation and not feel as if I'm being pressured by a system or by representatives of law enforcement to cooperate in a way that makes me unsafe or uncomfortable in getting the justice that right now the system defines. These are common answers. And it leaves very little room, the way things are right now, leaves very, very little room for the very real human side of the experience that Mr. Azim mentioned, is that, you know, once we are living in this perpetual state of processing our grief and the loss of our loved ones, how are we going to carry this legacy forward in a way that does honor to them? And again, that question is not often asked. So I think what most survivors, when you speak to them, would say to the question that you pose is that we would like to be asked. Survivors would like to be asked, what is it that you need? How is it that we can support your healing? What, what solutions or remedy would you like to this situation that actually addresses the root cause of it and prevents it from happening again, so that you feel safe and that your community has long-term safety? And then how does this bring honor to your loved one and to your journey? And I think if we were reorienting and asking questions in that way, we would see much different outcomes. We would see more opportunities for the kind of healing and the kind of impactful stories that Mr. Azim has, but more than that, the impact that it has, the residual impact that it has on everyone else. Because one of the most compelling things that a survivor can do is move through their healing journey so that they can inspire others to do the same. They can provide a tangible example of what that looks like. And that's the same thing for folks who may have committed harm and may have also been harmed through their act or through things that they've experienced in their lives. We need to model for each other how to progress through that pain, how to progress through that trauma, how to have what support actually looks like, and deal with the root of it so that we can prevent it from happening again. And so these conversations are critical to making that real. And we need to continue to do them in a way that doesn't over politicize the issue, but actually humanize the issue so that we can prevent it from happening.
Thank you, Tish. Tanish, that was wonderful. Thank you. Keith or Azim, do you want to weigh in on any of that?
Yeah, I actually, have a lot of thoughts about what Tanish, what you just shared, and certainly what Azim shared, and I appreciate the perspective that you shared about just what's missing in terms of listening to what survivors want and need. And as I look at this process, as I typically do, through the lens that involves the parole consideration hearing process, just to set the stage for what a parole hearing looks like. The people who go to the parole board are those sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. So if they can change their lives and demonstrate to the parole board that they can safely be released, then they're supposed to be released. About a third of California's prison population goes through is serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole. So they're at the hearing. Parole commissioners are there, 2 or 3 parole commissioners. The district attorney's office that prosecuted the case is invited to participate in the hearing, and also the survivors of the case are invited to attend and participate in the parole hearing. And most of the time, survivors are not present in parole hearing. I've handled hundreds of parole hearings, and it's only about 10% of all parole hearings that involve the presence at the hearing of a survivor from the crime. I think for a lot of reasons. One of those is the sort of re-traumatizing effect of the hearing itself. But what I've observed in sitting through these hearings and observing and listening to survivors talk about their experience and talk about their interactions with this system we've been talking about, there are at least 3 things that have become clear in my observations. One is that they don't feel served by the police, the courts, prisons, the parole boards, all of whom use them as a means to get long prison sentences and to keep people in prison, to block their release. So they don't feel served by any of those. The second thing that I noticed is that they have genuine questions about why the person caused the harm they caused. And I think those questions are, for a lot of people, a really important step along their healing journey. And there's no way in which the current parole process helps people along that process. The third thing is that they want some assurance that the person who caused them harm will not cause harm to anyone else. In other words, they're not asking for punishment for punishment's sake. Rather, they're asking for something that meets those needs I just mentioned. And sadly, under this current system, these needs remain unmet year after year, parole hearing after parole, decade after decade. And just last week, I contacted, there's this office within the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. It's called the Office of Victims and Survivors' Rights and Services. I reached out to them because a survivor in a case that I've handled asked me to have my client participate in what they call a victim offender dialogue, which has become popular recently, but it's a long-standing practice to connect people who've caused harm with those who've experienced the harm, or a surrogate for either one, to allow them to ask questions, answer questions, say what they need to say, hear what they need to hear for their mutual healing efforts. And so I reached out to this office that's supported by a couple $1 million a year, I guess, to support survivors of crime. And I said, the victim approached me, wants to engage in this dialogue. Is this something you can facilitate? Their response was, well, we don't do that. We can help you write a letter of remorse to the person. And I'm thinking, well, we've done that for years. We know how to do that. We have a survivor looking to be served and supported by this system that sometimes claims to be providing that support. And the response is, we don't do that. We can't give you what you need. We can't give you access to what it is you're looking for. And so it's silly, probably worse than that, for us to continue contributing to supporting a system that cannot give survivors what they actually need, and doesn't even try, doesn't even pretend that they can do that. And I look forward to us really investing in other ways that actually lend themselves to healing.
Azim?
Underscore what Tanish and Keith have both said, but the idea behind justice shouldn't be punitive. I mean, if you look and say, Tony killed my one and only son, he should be hung from the highest pole, how does that improve society? So I think it takes personal responsibility that as Americans, we are the most violent first world society in the world. Why is that? And what part as a citizen do we have to take on? So to me, justice is not done or served till three things happen. First, you have to make the victim whole. And Tanish talked about that victims need help. And they need a lot of help. Because when you lose a loved one, it's very traumatic. And you need somebody to hold your hand and help you get through it. Well, you can't bring my son back. I get that. He's gone forever. But understanding that if you go through life as a victim, there is no quality. I didn't want to go through life on crutches. I lost my one and only son. I had a full life and he was alive. I want that back. Most victims do. And the second piece is, if you go the other way to resentment, anger, retribution, and hatred, who are you hurting? You're hurting yourself. You might as well take a whip and beat yourself up. It's self-abuse. So I think it's important to get that across, that healing can come through forgiveness in my case. If forgiveness is not always going to be a strategy, but there is therapy, there is other ways that the victims need to be served. And I think Keith talked about it, Anish talked about it. The second part of justice should be you bring the offender back into society as a functioning and a contributing member. They're people. They're humans like we are. And even if they've committed a crime, I truly believe that we all have something hidden within us that is our own. We need to look for it and help. We can help the incarcerated people to come back into society and be an applied expert, much like Tony has done. So I think part of justice should be a commitment by society, by community, to help the offender come back into society and make sure to help other young people not follow in their former footsteps. Tony's doing that. There's a program called LCP, Life Connection Program, that is in federal prison. In fact, I'm on my way next month to speak at Terre Haute, which is a federal prison, where the recidivism rate in the adult system is almost 2/3. But if they go through the LCP program, which is offered to all the inmates that are going to be paroled in the next 3 years, the recidivism drops to under 17%, which tells me that 83% are out there doing good work. So I truly believe there's a lot of resources within our prison system that, if garnered and harvested, will create less crime in our community. And the third part of justice should be that the community has to be healed. When a young person dies, we're all traumatized. I mean, Uvalde, we were all traumatized. So I think that we have to address that crime happens in the context of community. And I find that the work we're doing in schools is also helping the community, because something good came out of something that was very tragic. So I think that this idea about justice has to be reframed so that we act with empathy, act with compassion, that we are restorative. We do what needs to be done to heal the victim, to bring the offender back as a contributing member of society and heal the community. It's a far more holistic and a compassionate way to go.
Thank you, Azim. I'm not surprised. I knew in the beginning we had very, very incredible panelists that would answer a lot of questions. Thank all of you. As we talked about this idea of healing, one of the core parts of Uncommon Law's work in this campaign is challenging the idea that someone is either a perpetrator or a victim. In fact, we know that the vast majority of people in prison today serving time for violent crimes were first survivors of violence themselves. Keith, can you talk about what healing looks like for Uncommon Law clients, both healing from the harm they caused and the harm they experienced?
Well, the first thing I would observe is just that the harm suffered and the harm caused are directly connected, directly linked. I mean, there's just a report that Impact Justice released this week, where they were in the middle of this study of men who have been incarcerated for violence, and they found that 91% of the respondents had experienced or witnessed violence in their homes or neighborhoods when they were children. 91%. And the incidence of violence, particularly physical and sexual violence, is even higher among women, particularly among trans women. And when you fast forward and folks are in prison for having caused harm, with very few exceptions, you see these same histories coming up over and over again, and there are not a lot of opportunities for them to address them and to start to heal from them while they're in prison. And my experience in parole hearings really lines up with the research. I mean, with very remarkable consistency. People are I get the opportunity, the privilege really, to walk with people through some of the most difficult, sensitive, painful experiences of their young lives. And our work is about helping them understand that what happened to them wasn't their fault. it wasn't a reflection of their value, their worth. Um, wasn't a reflection that there was something wrong with them that they needed to overcome or fix. And too often what we see is that people who experience harm in their childhood, um, they feel like they need to act in a certain way or associate with certain groups or consume certain substances in order to make up for or avoid feeling the personal insecurities and pain that really develop from those abuse histories. And so too often we see that people interpret that abuse as something wrong with them, and they have often, among the folks we represent, they've chosen harmful means of overcoming some of those issues. But healing looks like finding a way to understand themselves, a way to recognize that what happened to them and what they may have done is not a reflection of who they are. It doesn't condemn them to prison for forever. That people don't deserve to die in prison, even though many of them were told in very clear terms that that was the fact when they were as young as 14, 15. And so healing, what we've seen is it looks like people finding the space to be vulnerable again. And usually that means unpacking layers and layers of heavy armor and protection that people needed to survive before they ever came to prison. And they get into prison, which is not a place to be vulnerable for the most part. But where we see healing happen is where they've carved out spaces, found people that they can connect with and do some of that work, that they can share those histories with, they can share those experiences, those pains, those fears. It happens sometimes with us. That's a lot of the work we consider that we provide trauma-informed counseling and legal representation, because we start with the assumption that people have these histories and need to be supported in this inquiry. But where the real healing happens is where they're doing that outside of their meetings with people on my staff, but they're doing it in communities that they create within the prisons. And when it happens, they come to the parole board with this this understanding of all the various factors that contributed to their actions in harming others, and some new coping skills, new ways to think about themselves and the people in the community that are so far away from how they thought back at the time of the crime. And they're much healthier long before they get out of prison. And just the last thing I'll note is that the people who have done this work and have dramatically transformed their lives, they're not doing it for the parole board. They're not doing it so that somebody can pat them on the back. It's because they want to create a new life for themselves and their community, their family. That's what happens. And they do that. They start that before they ever get out of prison. So it's not really, it shouldn't be a surprise that they're successful when they come home. Azim mentioned low recidivism rates from the program he referred to. People released from life sentences have recidivism rates between 1% and 3%. And most people have no idea of that. But it's because people change. People grow out of crime, certainly violent crime, but also their associations change. The way they view themselves changes. And so having seen that happen for so many people who committed some of the worst violence we can imagine, and to see who they become through their own personal transformation is what inspires me to keep doing this work.
I want to kind of weigh in on that, and I am really a living witness to the work of Uncommon Law. I could remember way back, I'm not sure if it was 7, 6 when Uncommon Law took me on. And I remember when Keith came to visit me on one of those visits, he started asking me all these questions, and it had to do with my past and things that impacted me to get to a point where I was a victim at that time. And I like stopped in the middle of the interview. I said, "Hey, are you a psychologist?" And he just looked at me, but he took me all the way back and I was able to understand. And so after, bringing that awareness to me, the prison didn't have programs that really dealt with understanding and the healing. So I developed this program real quick called Remember Me. And that program actually, it was for me to look at the damage, the pain and the suffering that I caused my victim indirectly. And I say indirectly because it was a shooting that I actually didn't participate in, but I drove the car. So I am still responsible for that. And to understand the impact and how it changed so many lives, I then start to remember at that time, I don't just have one or two or three victims. My victims are numberless because I've impacted the community with the decision I made. I've impacted family members, friends, spouses, children. So my victims have become numberless. And to understand the pain that I caused them, I can now work on me. And I had to forgive myself, but I needed to understand the agony, the pain that I can't even describe. And it saddens me to this day. And just to see how amazing uncommon law is, and I don't know if anyone's seen this, I'm actually on a panel with survivors and I'm an offender. And so that in itself is just, it's an honor. And I'm so grateful. And I thank you for allowing me to be here today. So with that, Tish or Tanisha, I'm sorry, or oh man, I can't even get it out because I'm all choked up now. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
We got you, and appreciate you so much being in this space. Wow, Keith, you said a lot. One thing that came up as you were just sharing your experience with working with folks, and I know our personal processes are in that as well, is that the difference sometimes between a victim and someone who has harmed is simply when you encounter them in their lifetime, right? And I think that is true for the majority of folks. And there may not be as many studies on the other side for victimization, but the studies that exist show that folks who have been harmed have not been harmed just once in their lives. Many times they've had repeat incidents of harm that have been unaddressed. And to your point, there's the symmetry between the two, because many times when you become a victim of a crime or you're harmed, you take on the identity of what happened to you. And you do adopt behaviors or coping mechanisms, or there's so much of you that changes because of this experience, and so much of you that is unclear about who you are supposed to be, who you told you're supposed to be, and how it impacts other people around you. And I appreciate, what you said, Carly, about having numberless victims. And I was having a conversation with a colleague earlier today who said this, actually, that he was a victim of a crime by losing a loved one, a sibling, and similar to me, and talked about how many people from that incident he had victimized or hurt. Let's say he had hurt or committed harms against as a result of the crime that he experienced, and the grief and the trauma that he was carrying that went addressed for a long time. So it's a cycle. In a nutshell, it is a cycle. The other thing that I think it's really important to recognize is part of who is identified as a victim. One is as defined by the criminal legal system. Who does the police report substantiate as the victim in the crime, or whether or not a crime was actually committed? There are so many people that have been harmed and been victimized that have never been substantiated by a police report, including many of the people who have harmed others. Right. And that is inherent to this larger conversation about who's deserving of sympathy, who's deserving of empathy, who's deserving of compassion, who's deserving of an opportunity to heal. And I think this is something that I heard you say, Azim, and this is critical, that healing should be a human right, because it is in the best interest of all of us that when someone is hurt or someone is ill, that they be provided an opportunity to heal, whether that's self-directed to take care of themselves or to be taken care of by community or to have systems in society that support that healing. That is a human right that we do not acknowledge. And a lot of it has to do with this concept that we have in our country about who is deserving. And especially when the criminal legal system supports that ideology and targets individuals, communities, and folks who have harmed as being the perpetrators of the crime and not a part of the larger society and the need to actually heal and address what happened. And it contributes to what we see here. It's the reason why there's so many similarities in all of our stories. And so I think unpacking that is critical for those of us who have had the opportunity, and I say the privilege, kind of speaking to what you said earlier, Keith, about the parole process and how challenging it is for victims and survivors for lots of different reasons to participate, but then really highlighting the fact that the system does not support it. For victims and survivors to get what they are requesting, if they are looking for closure or justice that includes a conversation and hearing and understanding why the individual committed the harm that they committed and who they are and where they fit into this larger storyline and what's happened to them in their lives and have been impacted. And that's really, really critical to acknowledge. Denying survivors the opportunity to hear that, to have that opportunity, to have that conversation, to hear that has caused so much more harm in our communities. It has led to so much more victimization and violence, so much more than I think people really understand. And the last thing I'll say is the majority of crimes that are committed, I know there are stats that support this and reports that will show it, there's very often a relationship or connection between the person who was harmed and the person who committed the harm. Interpersonal violence is very, very common. There are instances where people have no relationship, and then this term innocent victim is often assigned to them, which again feeds back into this larger cycle that we have of who's deserving to be acknowledged. If someone has a dual experience as someone who committed a harm in the past, but then became a victim somewhere later in their life, then somehow one experience cancels the other, and they're not a pure victim. That does absolutely nothing for healing, for safety, or for justice. In fact, is the most unjust way of looking at what needs to happen when someone is harmed. And so I think that acknowledgement is important. It's important to have these conversations, and as much as we like to use the word humanize, it really is a triggering thing to continue to hear that we have to humanize each other in the experiences that we have, because there are many folks who don't have to struggle to humanize their experiences. They are automatically considered as part of their journey. And I think that we have to do a better job of continuing to tell these stories so that we can spread that compassion around to everyone, because that's what's going to keep us safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanish. I want to get into our next set of questions. I see you, Azim, but I want to get to that final question for you because I want to hear that response. And then you can weigh in maybe a little bit on this last question. But justice and punishment are often synonymous in this country. There's this idea that retribution will bring closure after harm happens. This sort of logic has driven really extreme sentencing structures like life sentences, life without parole, and the death penalty. Tanish, your organization has advocated for a special review of people who have served at least 10 years in prison and have been assessed low risk for violence. Would you consider the public demand for justice and punishment to be a barrier to something like this?
I think it has been, and mostly for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons I think came up in, as Keith described, the parole process is that most people don't understand how it actually works and the biases that inherently exist within the systems that prevent actual justice, prevent people from being looked at as whole human beings, having their healing and rehabilitation properly assessed. Who's in the room, who's having these conversations, who advocates. There are too many variables that really do have an impact on people's lives, safety, and overall whether or not the justice system actually works. And so by advocating that, there is a timeline and changes, it doesn't fix the system because the system is flawed. There's no way to perfect the system. And I think that is the takeaway from this, is that we have to come with a new strategy and a new approach that really centers on healing. But the current process that stands, there has to be changes to it so that we can make opportunities for citizens to return and actually help this restorative process that we have of healing our communities. And we know that the system right now doesn't currently allow for that. The conversation and the thinking about retribution actually equaling justice and closure is a barrier, but this is why it's important for survivors to have an opportunity to speak. Because when you hear Mr. Azim, when you hear myself, when you hear some of the other survivors who were denied the opportunity to speak in the parole processes, and even those who have been unfairly penalized by the criminal legal system because they did not want to cooperate. They didn't see that as being in their best interest. We again end up in a situation where the state takes on the voice of the survivor, moves on their behalf, in the interest of justice. And again, it ends up being a miscarriage of justice because we don't get the outcome that we really want, which is to prevent this from happening again and give the survivors the support that they actually need. So there are barriers, but I think that the most important thing we can do is continue to shift the narrative by telling truth, by helping folks understand, both through data and science, why long sentencing doesn't work, what exactly happens in the criminal legal process, which is something that most novice folks don't understand, and even someone who works on policy. I'm not a criminal legal expert. So there's so much to learn and so much to understand, and there's so much more to understand about how reforms do and do not impact people's lives, and this larger notion of how we keep our communities safe. So there's a lot of work to be done, but this is a part of that process.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hazim, you've talked about how we have a lot of resources in our prisons. What do we lose when we lock people up for the remainder of their lives? And if you want to touch a little bit on that last question, we're just falling short. So I want to give you that opportunity.
No, I think what Tanish and Keith both said was very, very appropriate. And I truly believe that punishment for the sake of punishment is barbaric. Death penalty is public display of vengeance. If anything, it creates more crimes. I mean, we are probably the only country in the world that has the death penalty, in the first world country. So I think that we need to reframe, and we need to understand that every human being has something of value buried within them. That is their only. That is their own attribute. And Colin, you're a great example of that, right? And you were able to, what Keith said, that went through some transformation because of Keith's intervention. But that can happen to everybody. Maybe not 100%. But as Keith mentioned, the recidivism on life sentence is 1 to 3%. I mean, the LCP program is 83%. Whereas that is not what the system does, because most every inmate is going to be paroled at some point. And if they cannot heal, and when we've all done bad things, and that can become a festering wound. And I think that empathy is important, that we need to heal that festering wound, and we need to provide. The programs are there. Programs like what happened to you, programs like what happened to Tony, that would inspire the kind of work you're doing and what Tony is doing, that we need to heal that wound in them. And one of the ways we can heal their wound is to help them go out back into community and redeem themselves, because they're applied experts. They want to make sure that other young people don't follow in their former footsteps. And they are far more effective, at least in the work we are doing, than PhDs in psychology, because they are street people that have actually traveled the road. So I think that this was very well articulated by both Keith and Tanish, that we need to look at our people in prison. They're part of our community. They have something very valuable to offer to us to reduce crime and create more safety, and that we must do whatever it takes. It's hard work, I get that. Kind of like, mining for precious metals. They're hard to find, they're very deep. And then you bring the stones with the dross. You have to separate the dross from the stones. You got to cut the stones and polish them to reveal its value. And I believe that that is available in, if not all of our people that are incarcerated or serving time in prison, but most of them. I think that we need to move to that kind of compassion and empathy, because they are people, they are human, they're part of our community.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Keith, can you reflect on what Tanisha and Hazim have shared? And how do you see things fitting into the broader story we're trying to tell about why people harm and why they heal?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why I knew this would be such a, powerful conversation, because of what both Tanisha and Azim have shared. Important parts of a much larger conversation. One note of, I'll say, correction, Azim. Kali didn't make her changes because of my help. My job was to help the parole board see who she is, see that transformation that she undertook on her own because she wanted to create a new life for herself. I'm honored and privileged to have been able to escort her on that journey. But also, I think, as many of us have touched on, either today in this conversation or elsewhere in our work, it's that, repairing and strengthening certain critical components of our communities is necessary to both prevent harm and to provide an access to healing from that harm. I think the real answer as to what people actually need almost always lies in, the basics of adequate housing, food security, educational opportunities, livable wage employment, access to healthcare, including mental health care, which includes addiction treatment. And police and prisons will never be a substitute for any of that. So we need to stop funding them like they will be. Instead, I think we need real investment in these other aspects of our communities so the communities can heal themselves. We talked about before about the types of spaces people carve out really in prison to do this work. Our communities want to do the same thing. Communities are capable of doing the same thing. We just need to reinvest, provide the resources to do what they know is best.
Encourage our viewers or the participants that took their time out to join us today to go back and check out the video that you can find on the link, as well as please, you can also make a donation. So I am making an appeal. So if you're able, it doesn't have to be a big gift. Please make a donation at uncommonlaw.org. How we heal / how we heal, and again, the link is on the screen. I'm not sure we have a little time for maybe a couple of questions. And one of the questions that we have, and please forgive me, Mr. Fulbright, if I mispronounce it, it's Derek Fulbright. It says, how do we get persons incarcerated to begin self-inquiry sooner? Who wants to take that? Well, I'll weigh in on a little bit, being that I was incarcerated. One of the things is for them to really begin to understand through programs that, like I mentioned earlier, is to start understanding um, it's not about you, it's about the people we harmed, the victims in each individual case. And we have to put ourselves aside. Um, and how that happens sooner is each individual. Most lifers that I've had the experience with during the 32 years want to start that process sooner, and most of them do start the process sooner. Um, I don't want to sound kind of biased, but it's those with the shorter time that normally don't begin that process of understanding, and then they become repeated. And we're sitting there and we watch them come in and out throughout our whole time. But most lifers do begin that in the women's prison. Let me say that start that inquiry a lot sooner. So I hope that answered your question. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I think that we need to really get to know the person. You can't have empathy for somebody you don't know. And I think that that is the way that needs to happen very early. I know everything they should know about Tony. He was born to a 15-year-old. His father was never in his life. His girlfriend seduced him when his uncle's girlfriend seduced him when he was 8 years old. I mean, if you look at Tony's life, you then have empathy that, it's not complicated to know why he acted as the way he did. He joined a gang at the age of 11. So he was a very angry kid. So I think that one way to do this sooner is part of the process should be to look at the history of the offender. And this has been said many times by all of you, that there isn't an offender that was not a victim. I've not met anybody, even working in prison, that was not a victim, that was not a survivor. And I think that once we acknowledge that at some level we've all harmed, and when people do harm, it's hurt people, that we need to, and Kit talked about the importance of mental health, that we need to start the conversation early and have empathy for their victimization. If we start there sooner, I think we can get them hopefully to transform like a colleague like you have, or like Tony has.
Thank you, Azim.
Yeah, I have a quick thing I would add also is that we have prisons that are ruled by cruelty and violence, and we've sent people there for hundreds of years at a time with little or no chance of parole. Their day-to-day focus is on survival. There's no room. There's no space to be vulnerable, to do this work, to ask the question, I wonder if I can explore my trauma history with anybody here. There's no, we've created the spaces that that shut down those opportunities, I think. So, I'm not a proponent of building new prisons, but I am saying that the ones we have are a real barrier to any of this kind of work.
Well said.
Thank you. Our next question is from Allison Villegas. Current parole grant is 13%. Why is this rate so low?
There are several layers to how I would answer this, but I think the simplest one is that the inherent bias in the decision-making process is against releasing people. And it's always been that way. And we tried to make some changes, the state did, back in the 70s, in eliminating indeterminate sentences for most people. That happened because the parole board at the time was racist. Its decision making was racist and biased, gender bias, age bias, racial bias was a reality. And that at the time, the state recognized that parole commissioners aren't able to actually predict anybody's future violence risk. They were just going by who they like and who they feel more comfortable with. Again, because of these biases. We've made some changes. They eliminated that type of decision making for a lot of people who went to prison, but they saved them for the more serious offenses like murder and some kidnappings, and the biases came with them. And so you fast forward to today, we see that Black and brown people are more likely to have these longer sentences, more likely to be at higher security level prisons, less likely to have access to meaningful programs, less likely to be granted parole when they go. So it's not really a mystery. It's just a question of whether we're ever going to do anything about it as a state. The parole board doesn't have any intention of raising the rate at which parole is granted. By the way, the reason this is important is because we have a law in California that says parole is supposed to normally be granted when people are eligible. So this 13% of all scheduled hearings, clearly not normally resulting in parole grants.
Right. Also, there's one other point was something that I remember from my story, and I think Keith mentioned this earlier, that when there is a parole hearing, the district attorney is also invited to be there. Now, I was there as a victim, and my voice was stronger than her, although I know her well, and she's a good district attorney, but she was against it because a district attorney is an elected position. And they don't want on their record to have somebody who took a life of somebody who's a murderer to come back into their community because of the perception that she might lose the next election. So most DAs are not supportive of people that deserve parole. Now, fortunately, my voice was stronger than her, and Tony was granted parole. Even normally, it never happens in the first hearing, and he's doing great. I mean, I'm very proud of what he has done, much like what Collie has done. I think he's already saving a lot of kids, and I see that she's seeing that. Now, whether she'll be there for the next hearing, I don't know, but we are definitely supporting that. Part of restorative justice is to bring the offender back as a contributing, functioning member of society, and this needs to be system accepted, and it also needs to be communicated, to the voting population, that we have a lot of resources in our prison.
Thank you both for that.
I just want to add, I don't know if you have another question, but just to highlight, I think Carlitha is an exceptional person. I know that she is. But that's not the standard for who gets out of prison. It shouldn't be. Like, it can't be that if you're going to go lead an organization, should we let you out of prison. Only if you're going to go be a star of a show, should we let you out of prison. Because most people will never have that access, never have that opportunity, never be seen as exceptional in that way. And so the standard is, if you've done your time, you've changed your life, you should have a fair chance to come home. And most people aren't getting that chance today.
Thank you so much for that. Again, I want to, do we have another question? We have time for another question? We have one more question, and then we have to wrap it up.
And before you ask that question, I know, Tanisha, you have to go right at 5, and I know we're not going to go over too much, but I just want to thank you for joining this conversation. It's been such a pleasure and honor, really, to be in this discussion with you. Same with you, Azim. I look forward to us doing more, building more things together.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, and it's been a pleasure.
And I want to say the same, Tanish. It was such a pleasure, such an honor. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Asim, you're not gone yet, so I'm going to thank you.
You're welcome.
So,
Thanks
our
for including me.
last question is from Rita Alfred. And the question is, how do we attend to the reality of our prison infrastructure based on more than punishment of being separated from society, which contributes directly to violence in and out of prison?
Absolutely. And restorative justice came from the Aboriginal cultures of New Zealand and Australia. When a crime happens, they put the youth in the middle of a circle. The whole village shows up and says something positive about the youth's attributes and encourages them to make amends with the victim, because they believe if you keep the youth more connected to community, he or she is less likely to reoffend. We separate, and our thinking is to lock them up and throw the key away. And what happens is we definitely contribute to more crime. So there again, I think that we need to reframe how we deal with social as well as criminal justice. And I think Tanisha made it very clear that the system is broke, and we need to make sure that we, educate the voting population so we get the right people making the right decisions.
Tanisha, you want to weigh in there in your last 45 seconds?
I would just say more truth telling. We cannot ignore the fact that there is a direct economic benefit to the system maintaining bodies in incarceration, and that needs to be named. And we also need to call attention to the stats that show that longer sentencing and the environments that we are putting people in when they have offended do absolutely nothing for public safety. Right. And I think that's important for us to continue to speak about, to demonstrate, and then on the other end, show what actually does work.
Right.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. I want to personally thank Azim, Keith, and Tanish for just a wonderful day today. And I'm sure that many were educated and based upon your expertise and your decades of work. I thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
I also
for sharing your personal story with us
in
your life, and it's having an impact on all of us. I know. Thank you.
You're welcome. If that's the least I can do to help change, make a difference, that's a small contribution. But I also want to make another appeal for donations. Again, you can go to the link that's running, actually been across the screen since we've actually been here. And also to go and check out the rest of the video at that link. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you all for attending. And I hope to do this again soon. Thank you so much. And a shout out to Annie, who has worked so hard to keep this together. Thank you, Annie.
Yeah.
Thanks, Annie.
She's been a joy to work with for sure. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Azim. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.